What if the most dangerous weapon ever created wasn't a gun? It was a book. And powerful people decided you were never meant to read these, because if you did, something would change they couldn't take back. Today we are covering 36 books that were dangerous, enough to ban, burn, and suppress across 5 centuries. A teenage girl's diary banned for being too honest about being a teenager. A novel about book burning that was physically edited by a school before handing it to students. These weren't banned because they were dangerous to you. They were banned because they were dangerous to the people banning them. One in 1852, a minister's wife from Connecticut published a novel that made half of America so furious they made it a criminal offense to own a copy. Harriet Beecher Stowe gave slavery something the American South had spent decades protecting itself from, a direct human portrait of what it actually looked like from the inside. Not a political debate between powerful men, but families torn apart, children sold from their mothers, entire Christian communities calling it God's will and looking away. Southern states made owning a copy a criminal offense. Distributing it could mean prison. Some states threatened death for sharing it with enslaved people. When Abraham Lincoln met Stowe in 1862, he reportedly called her the little woman who wrote the book that started the Great War. In 1929, a German veteran published a novel about the First World War that sold 2.5 million copies in 18 months, and told the truth about what war actually felt like, from the ground. Not glory or sacrifice. Terrified teenage boys rotting in trenches, watching friends die for reasons nobody could explain, returning home broken to a country that had no idea what they'd been through. That memory directly contradicted everything the Nazi Party needed countries to believe. In 1933 they burned it publicly, stripped Remarque of his citizenship, and watched him disappear into exile. His sister Elfriede had no such escape. Arrested in 1943 for making remarks critical of the regime, she was beheaded, the judge telling her directly she was beheaded, paying the price her brother had avoided. They killed his sister because they couldn't reach him. Remarque learned of her death safely, in America, and dedicated his next book to her. In 1989, the leader of an entire country ordered the death of a novelist he had never met. For a book he had likely never finished reading, Salman Rushdie had written a novel weaving dream sequences about the origins of Islam into a story about identity and migration. Ayatollah Khomeini declared it blasphemous and issued a fatwa, a religious ruling calling for Rushdie's execution, with a bounty attached, valid anywhere on earth. Rushdie went into hiding for almost a decade under round-the-clock police protection. His Akomin, Japanese translator, was stabbed to death. His Italian translator was attacked and survived. His Norwegian publisher was shot 3 times and lived. Bookstores stocking it were firebombed across multiple countries. In 2022, 33 years after the fatwa was issued, Rushdie was attacked on stage at a literary festival in New York and lost sight in one eye. The order had never been lifted. It had just been waiting. This is the only book on this list banned specifically for being too honest about a teenage Mogmer girl's inner life. Anne Frank wrote it in hiding from the Nazis, in an attic in Amsterdam, never expecting anyone but herself to read it. She was arrested in 1944 and died in a concentration camp, months before the war ended. Her father published her diary nearly untouched afterward. Decades later, American school districts pulled it from shelves, not because of the Holocaust, but because of passages where Anne described her own body with the same plain honesty she used for everything else. Some parents called those pages inappropriate for children the same age as the author when she wrote them. The book that survived the Nazis was challenged, 60 years later, for being too candid about what it feels like to be a teenage girl. Imagine waking up every morning knowing a camera in your bedroom is watching you. That bastit, the government has decided what is true. And disagreeing, even privately, even in your bedroom own mind, is a crime. That the newspaper you read yesterday has been quietly rewritten bedroom. George Orwell wrote it as a warning about the most powerful form of control ever invented. Not controlling what people do, but what they dare to think. Watch someone closely think enough for long enough, and they eventually become their own prison guard, policing their own mind before anyone else has to. He gave the system a name, Big Brother, and invented vocabulary for everything it did: doublethink, thought crime, newspeak. Because systems without names cannot be judged. The Soviet Union banned it instantly. Every communist government in Europe followed. The very governments it was warning people about were the first ones to ban it. In 1958, A man stood before the world and said he could not accept the greatest honor in needs literature. Not because he didn't want it, but because his government told him if he did, he would never come home. Pasternak spent 10 years writing a love story set against the Russian Revolution. A story that said the revolution had crushed the very people it promised to free. The Soviet government banned it before a single copy printed inside Russia. Then the CIA got hold of the manuscript, had it printed, and quietly distributed copies at a global festival. Not because they loved literature, but because humiliating the USSR was worth more than any spy operation. Pasternak won the Nobel Prize that year and was forced to refuse it under threat of exile. He begged Khrushchev personally to let him stay in his own country. They let him. 2 years later, he was dead. Ray Bradbury wrote a novel about a future where firemen don't put out fires. They start them, burning every house where books are found. It became one of the most celebrated warnings against censorship ever written. American school boards then banned it anyway. Some districts objected to the swearing, some to a scene involving the Bible being burned. One school distributed a censored version with several passages physically blacked out. A novel about book burning, edited by the exact kind of institution it was written to warn against. Bradbury found out years later and was furious. He said if his book could be handed to students with pieces missing, that wasn't a misunderstanding of the story. That was the story, happening again in real time. 8. Picture a farm where animals overthrow their human owner and build a new society on one promise. Everyone is equal. No one will ever be exploited again. It sounds like a children's story. It was written as a warning for adults. The pigs who lead the rebellion slowly accumulate power, rewrite the rules, and become indistinguishable from the humans they replaced. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The Soviet Union banned it immediately, but here is the part nobody mentions. The CIA secretly funded an animated film adaptation in 1954 as anti-Soviet propaganda, then quietly changed the ending to make it less critical of capitalism than Orwell had written. A book arguing that every system of power corrupts itself was corrupted by every system of power that touched it. 9. In 1939, John Steinbeck published a novel about a family fleeing the Dust Bowl for Polk, California, only to find the people waiting for them were just as cruel as the disaster they'd escaped. Within weeks, copies were being burned in public bonfires, in California itself. Steinbeck had spent months visiting migrant camps undercover. The wealthy landowners who organized the burnings weren't objecting to fiction, they were objecting to recognition. They saw their own labor practices, their own camps, described with the accuracy of none, someone who had actually been there. Kern County banned it from schools and libraries for over a year. Copies were burned outside the very libraries meant to hold them. The book won the Pulitzer Prize the following year. The county that burned it issued a formal apology in 2004, 61 years later. 10. In 1985, a retired British intelligence officer wrote a book the government would spend 3 years and millions of pounds trying to destroy. Peter Wright claimed Roger Hollis, the man who ran MI5 for 9 years, had been a Soviet spy, that British intelligence had been compromised from the very top, that the government knew, investigated quietly, and buried it. The government sued Wright in Australia and New Zealand simultaneously. They lost every credit case. Each defeat made front-page news and sold another 100,000 copies. Britain banned it domestically. British readers ordered copies from abroad and passed them between friends like contraband. The spy it exposed was never prosecuted. 11. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published a pamphlet that would become the most banned, burned, and feared document of the next 2 centuries. Their argument was simple. The working classes of every country were being systematically robbed by the people who owned the factories, the land, and the governments, and the only solution was to take power back by force if necessary. That idea, written clearly enough for any literate person to understand, was the threat. European governments were already terrified of revolution, and here was a document actively calling for it, telling ordinary people the system oppressing them was deliberately constructed by people who benefited from their suffering. Marx was expelled from Belgium, then France, then Germany. He settled in London, spent with the rest of his life in poverty, and was watched constantly by secret police who never stopped fearing what he'd written. 23 pages. That was all it took. 12. In 1957, a bookstore owner in San Francisco was arrested for selling a poem. Not weapons, not incitement, a poem, to people who had walked in and asked for it. The charge was obscenity. Allen Ginsberg had written about the people America had disappeared, committed to what era, institutions, criminalized for their sexuality, economically discarded while the country decrepitures, congratulated itself on prosperity. Millions were living those lives in total silence, convinced they were alone. Hal told them they weren't. It didn't argue for anything. It simply refused to pretend. The judge acquitted the bookstore owner, ruling the poem had redeeming social importance, a phrase that became the foundation for literary freedom in America. 13 in 1937, Japanese soldiers entered the Chinese city of Nanking and killed over 300,000 Byosenshais, civilians, in 6 weeks. The Japanese government's response over the following decades was brute forward, deny it happened, remove it from textbooks, pressure other governments to treat it as disputed exaggeration. In 1997, historian Iris Chang documented the massacre through survivor testimony, Japanese soldier diaries and photographic evidence that had sat in archives for 60 years. Japan's response was immediate. Officials discredited the book. Nationalist groups pressured bookstores to pull it. Publishers refused to translate it. Chang received death threats serious enough to require security protection. She died in 2004 at 36. The Japanese government has still never formally acknowledged the full scale of what happened. 14 in 1962. Marine biologist Rachel Carson published a carefully documented argument that pesticides like DDT were silently poisoning birds, contaminating water supplies, entering the pro-human food chain, and causing cancers in people who had no idea they were being exposed. The chemical industry had sold these products to governments and households for decades. Carson's evidence didn't just threaten their profits. It made them responsible for knowingly poisoning the public. So before a single copy reached shelves, the industry hired scientists to discredit her research, circulated fake dismissals, and attacked her personally, questioning her credentials because she was a woman, calling her a communist because they had nothing scientific left to say. Carson died of cancer 2 years after publication. 15. Toni Morrison based her 1987 novel on a real enslaved woman who killed her own infant daughter rather than let her be recaptured into slavery. A true story Morrison found buried in an 1856 newspaper clipping. The book won the Pulitzer Prize. It also became one of the most challenged novels in American schools over the following 3 decades. Parents citing violence and disturbing imagery. What they were actually objecting to was that Morrison refused to make slavery comfortable to teach. She wrote what it does to a person's mind, not just their body. She didn't soften it or give it a redemptive arc that let readers finish the chapter feeling resolved. The most frequently banned book about slavery in American schools is the one historians consider most essential for understanding what slavery actually did to human beings. 16 in 1974. A former CIA officer named Victor Marchetti finished a book that made American history before a single copy reached a bookshop. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what the government did to stop it. Marchetti had spent 14 years inside the CIA, watching an institution that ran covert operations and manipulated foreign governments while answering to nobody. The CIA took him to court before publication and forced the removal of 168 separate passages, the first time in American history a court had allowed pre-publication censorship of a book. The publishers printed every deleted passage as a blank white space marked "idiot" in brackets. Readers didn't just buy a book. They bought 168 visible pieces of evidence that their government was hiding something. 17 in 1904. Journalist Upton Sinclair spent 7 weeks living undercover inside Chicago's meat packing factories, documenting what actually happened to the animals, the meat and nothing, the workers every single day. He wrote it to expose the brutal exploitation of immigrant workers, people losing fingers to machinery and returning to work because stopping meant starvation, children in dangerous conditions, human beings treated as disposable. He wanted America to feel rage on their behalf. America read it and felt rage, but about the meat. The contamination details made the country recoil. The government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act within months, and the industry quietly buried every chapter threatening its labor practices while accepting the food beyond safety reforms that protected its reputation. Nothing. Sinclair said it himself. He aimed at the public's heart and accidentally hit them in the stomach. 18 in 1971. Military analyst Daniel Ellsberg walked out of his office carrying photocopies of Puri's 7,000 classified pages proving the United States government had been systematically lying about the Vietnam War for decades. Not miscalculating, deliberately lying, while sending young men to die in a war 4 consecutive presidents privately knew was unwinnable. Nixon obtained a court order blocking publication, the first time in American history a court had legally prevented a newspaper from printing a story. The Supreme Court overturned it within 15 days. Nixon then sent operatives to break into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, hunting for Puri's information to destroy his reputation. That same team was arrested 2 years later during Puri's the Watergate break-in, the scandal that ended Nixon's presidency. Ellsberg died in 2023, still believing the public deserved to know what their government was doing in their name. 1945, as the full horror of the Holocaust became known to the world. The German state of Bavaria seized the copyright to Hitler's autobiography and made a decision nobody would dollars reprint it. For 70 years, they kept that promise. Hitler had written it in 1925, laying out his hatred of Jewish people, his belief in racial superiority, and his plans to rebuild Germany through violence, plainly, years before a single camp was built. The copyright expired January 1, 2016. Germany immediately published an annotated Barrier academic edition with over 3,500 critical footnotes, designed to challenge every claim Hitler made. Within weeks it had sold out completely. A book suppressed for 70 years became a bestseller the moment the law allowed it. Nobody could agree whether that proved the ban had worked, or proved it never could. In 1959. A white journalist chemically darkened his skin and traveled through the American South for 6 weeks, passing as a black man. What John Howard Griffin documented wasn't occasional prejudice, it was a complete system. A man with identical clothes, voice, and intelligence, treated as a full human being one day, and as something less the next, based entirely on skin color. Jobs unavailable, restaurants closed, the casual daily machinery of dehumanization running so smoothly that most white Americans could look straight at it and not see it. Nobody could call it exaggeration. He had run the experiment on his own body and documented the results. His hometown in Texas burned him in effigy. Death threats forced his family to relocate to Mexico. 21. The book contained no sex scenes. Not a single one. A British court read it cover to cover, found one line implying 2 women loved each other, and ordered every copy destroyed, declaring it more dangerous to public morality than pornography. Virginia Woolf, who wanted to testify in its defense, was not permitted to speak. Hall's protagonist doesn't seduce anyone. She simply loves another woman and asks quietly whether there is any place in the world for someone like her. That question, not an act, just a question, was what the court found obscene. Because if the question was allowed to exist in print, the people asking it in private were allowed to exist too, and an entire architecture of law and religion built on their invisibility would have to answer for itself. The book was banned in Britain for 20 years, 22 in 1990. Simon & Schuster paid Bret Easton Ellis $300,000 for his novel, read the final manuscript, and canceled publication 1 month before release. They let him keep the money. They just couldn't put their name on what he'd written. Ellis had written a wealthy New York investment banker who murdered people in his spare time, described with the same flat detail he gave designer suits and business cards. The horror wasn't the violence, it was the equivalence. A culture so consumed by status that human life and luxury goods had become the same category of thing. Another publisher ran it. It became one of the most discussed novels of the decade. In Queensland, Australia, it is still sold today in a sealed wrapper, restricted to adults. 30 years later, 23 in 1759, copies of a slim satirical novel began appearing across Europe, with no author's name on the cover. Within weeks it had been banned and burned in Geneva and Paris, and the Catholic Church added it to their official list of forbidden books. Voltaire had hidden, behind a comic adventure story, a systematic destruction of the age's most comforting idea, that the world was fundamentally good and suffering had meaning. His hero was dragged through war, slavery, earthquake, and massacre, watching that optimism collapse at every turn. Every institution he encountered, the church, the aristocracy, the military, the legal system, was exposed as cruel and indifferent. Every powerful institution in Europe recognized themselves in those pages. Voltaire outlived every ban they imposed, dying in 1778 as the most famous writer in Europe, still officially banned in the country that produced him. 24 At the 1960 obscenity trial, the prosecution's lead lawyer asked the jury to consider whether Mysticus this was a book they would want their wife or their servants to read. He intended it as a damning question. D.H. Lawrence had written an aristocratic woman, married to a man left paralyzed by the First World War, who falls into a passionate relationship with the estate's gamekeeper. Their physical intimacy, described with a directness that had never appeared in mainstream literature. Not to shock, but to argue that intimacy between two human beings was not something shameful to be hidden. Lawrence died in 1930 with the book still banned in Britain and America. The full version wasn't legally published in either country until 1960, when a British court finally acquitted it after a national debate about who had the right to decide what adults were allowed to read. 25 In 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte, the most powerful man in Europe, read a novel and ordered its author imprisoned without trial, without formal charges, without conviction. The Marquis de Sade had written a story following an innocent young woman through a world of systematic cruelty, where virtue was punished and depravity rewarded at every turn. He wasn't writing fantasy. He was holding a mirror up to power, showing how thin the line was between respectable society and the darkness it pretended didn't exist. That was what Napoleon couldn't tolerate. Not the content, but the implication. That men in power and Sade's villains were operating by the same logic with different costumes. Sade spent the rest of his life in Charenton Asylum, never formally convicted of any crime. He died there in 1814, still writing. His name became a word. The asylum couldn't stop that. 26 In 1559, the Catholic Church sat down and made a list of every book too dangerous for ordinary people to read. Near the top was a slim volume by a Florentine political advisor that Musit's Montserrat across Europe for decades, quietly terrifying every institution that understood what it was actually saying. Every theorist before Machiavelli had dressed power in divine language, God-given, sacred, unquestionable. He stripped that away and wrote about how rulers actually behaved, that successful leaders lied when lying served them, and used the appearance of virtue, rather than virtue itself, to control populations. The threat wasn't that it taught rulers something new. Every powerful person already operated this way. It was that it was written clearly enough for anyone to read. The church kept it banned for over 200 years because a population that has read The Prince stops seeing authority and starts seeing strategy. 27 In 1918, James Joyce began publishing chapters of a novel following one ordinary man through one ordinary day in Dublin, including his sexual thoughts, his bodily functions, his unfiltered interior monologue. What the Postal Service found obscene wasn't titillation. It was nenum bun he libelthage, interiority, the unedited texture of how a human mind actually moves through the world. The Postal Service began confiscating and burning issues of the magazine carrying it. The book was banned in America for 11 years. Copies had to be smuggled in from Paris, hidden in luggage, seized at borders by customs officers given specific instructions to find them. When a federal judge finally lifted the ban in 1933, his ruling established that literature had the right to tell the full truth about human experience. Every book published freely in America after that moment exists partly because of that decision. 28 In 1961, a publisher put a book on American shelves that the city of Boston immediately decided was too dangerous for its citizens to read. What followed was the last major obscenity trial in American history. William Burroughs wrote it in Tangier, in raw hallucinatory scenes depicting addiction and dependence control, arguing that governments and social systems operated by the same mechanism as addiction, keeping people dependent and compliant by controlling what they needed to survive. The threat wasn't the explicit content. It was the argument underneath. Norman Mailer and Allen Ginsberg testified in its defense. The court acquitted it. Burroughs later said he couldn't remember writing most of it. The book that changed American literary freedom was written by a man who wasn't entirely sure it was him. 29 In 1965, one of the most important books about race and self-transformation in America was published 2 weeks after its author was assassinated. The people with the most reason to silence Malcolm X had already done it. But the book survived and hit the next wall immediately. Malcolm had spent years in prison, transforming himself through reading and a growing understanding of the system that had put him there. He wrote it as a direct message to the men still inside that education was the most dangerous weapon they could pick up. American federal prisons banned it. The exact population Malcolm had written it for was told. They were not allowed to read it. Some correctional facilities still restrict it today. 30 in 1999. A Canadian philosopher published a book the entire mainstream academic and publishing world quietly decided nobody needed to read. John McMurtry argued the global economy had stopped working for people and started feeding on them. The same way a cancer cell doesn't attack out of cruelty, it just keeps growing because stopping means its own death. Hospitals pricing sick people out of treatment. Universities are drowning students in debt. Governments cut programs that kept poor families alive while protecting corporations already richer than most countries. The threat was that McMurtry wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was a credentialed academic with specific, serious evidence, specific enough that ignoring it required effort. Every major publisher passed. Academic journals refused to engage. It was buried not through law but through silence. 31 in 1932. Aldous Huxley published a novel about the future that made governments far more uncomfortable than any bomb-throwing revolutionary ever had. Not because it described violence, because it described something governments recognized in themselves. Huxley's version of control had nothing to do with fear or force. People were kept obedient through pleasure, endless entertainment, effortless sex, a happiness drug that smoothed away every uncomfortable thought before it could develop into anything dangerous. Nobody poison was imprisoned or tortured. People were simply kept too comfortable to want anything that threatened the system providing their comfort. That was what made it unsettling. Not a boot stamping on a human face, people lining up voluntarily for the stamp because it felt good. The society Huxley warned about in 1932 looks less like fiction every single year. 100 million people. Not an estimate. A documented, country-by-country count of every person killed under communist regimes across the 20th century. Published in France in 1997, it was never banned. What happened to it was worse. Threat wasn't the number itself. It was what the number meant for Europe's intellectual class. The philosophers and academics who had spent decades defending or excusing these regimes. 100 million dead meant they had been completely, publicly, irreversibly wrong. So the book wasn't burned. It was quietly discredited, sidelined in universities. Reviewers attacked the methodology rather than engage with the evidence. Europe had built museums and memorials for one atrocity of the 20th century. For the larger one, it built a silence. 33 in 1964. Jackie Kennedy personally chose journalist William Manchester to write the official comment of her husband's assassination, giving him access no other writer had. She trusted him completely. Manchester spent 3 years and over 1,000 hours of interviews, producing something raw and intimate, including details about Jackie's private grief in the hours after the shooting, conversations she had shared believing they would be handled with discretion. When she read the finished manuscript, she went to court to stop it being published. Manchester argued he had written exactly what he had been asked to write, the truth. The legal battle became bigger international news than the book itself. Manchester published it with minor changes. The book Jackie Kennedy tried to suppress became one of the best-selling accounts of the assassination ever written. 34 in June 1215. A group of English noblemen forced their king to sign a document limiting his own power, something that had never been done before in the Western world. King John agreed that no free person could be imprisoned or stripped of property without proper legal proofs. For the first time in English history, power had a written boundary. It lasted 10 weeks. Pope Innocent III declared it illegal, null and void, and ordered it destroyed, calling it shameful, and instructing King John to ignore everything he had signed. The first written guarantee of basic human rights in Western history was cancelled by a man in Rome who had never been elected by anyone. The ideas inside it refused to die. Every democratic legal system in the modern world carries its fingerprints. 35 in 1644, English poet John Milton wrote the most powerful argument for freedom of dirty expression ever put on paper. The argument was simple. Governments had no right to deter stuff their people could read. Banning books didn't protect society, it insulted it. He aimed it directly at England's licensing order, the law requiring every book to be deter estate approved before printing. Suppressing an idea doesn't kill it, he wrote. It just means deter a lot and brain people control which ideas survive. He called censorship the murder of knowledge itself. The government didn't debate him. They didn't refute him. They used the exact law he was attacking to block his pamphlet from circulating freely. A document defending the freedom to publish, suppressed by the very mechanism it was written to expose. The government that banned it is gone. The book outlived them by 400 years. 36 in the 1950s. A black woman named Henrietta Lacks was dying of cervical cancer in a PUPO, segregated ward in Baltimore. Without her knowledge or consent, her doctors took a sample PUPO of her cells. Those cells turned out to be extraordinary. The first human cells to survive and reproduce in a laboratory. Scientists used them to develop the polio vaccine, advance cancer research, and make discoveries worth billions of dollars across the following decades. Henrietta Lacks died in 1951. Her family couldn't afford healthcare. For decades, they didn't even know her cells existed, let alone that they were generating a global medical industry. The book documenting what happened, written by journalist Rebecca Skloot and PUPO, pitched in 2010, wasn't banned. It was quietly excluded from certain institutional conversations, its implications about race, consent, and medical exploitation treated as uncomfortable rather than urgent. Her cells are still used in laboratories around the world today. Her family has never been compensated. Governments don't ban books because they are dangerous to you. They ban them because they are dangerous to the people doing the banning. Every single one of these stories is still unfinished. The systems they exposed are still running. Which one hit you hardest? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. If you made it here, hit subscribe. We find the altavories that were buried and bring them back into the light.